the woodworks, is a good build. It's just they were made, I think, for a price, which was, I guess, pretty substantial if you think about that. The equivalent price today of 90,000. They weren't cheap. A lot of timber, a lot of man hours, and Jeff definitely knew what he was doing. But I guess he's still working to a budget according to what the boss wants.
Interestingly, once Andrew found solid evidence of the coach's true origins, some of the more subtle signs that it hadn't been made by Australia's most iconic coach company by one of its own team of master craftsmen also began to emerge.
That's another thing that struck me when I first looked at the vehicle at Alan Saunders' shed, was normally the ends of timber, if it's been through a coachworks, there's no such thing as just cutting off the end of a timber. It's usually shaped, quite often carved. Even rudimentary things like cane wagon that we've got, you look closely, there's carvings done on the end as a finish. This one has nothing like that. So instantly you're going, it's not made at a coachworks by people who are, in that business, in that trade. It doesn't have those niceties. It's just sawn off. If anything, it's got a bevel on some pieces, but most of them are 90-degree saw. That's probably just something that they picked up from the master when they did their apprenticeships, and they'll tell their apprentices how to do it when they're tradesmen. This is how we finish a piece of timber.
Which still leaves the question, why? Why was this replica coach made? Sure, Harvey Carter had the original plans for a Cobb Co coach, and in Jeff Ernst, he had someone with the skills to turn those plans into reality. But it's still a pretty expensive project to take on, unless there's someone at the end signing the cheques.
Being a money man, I don't know he would have really just gone out on a limb. He probably knew there was a market there, if not a specific buyer. But I think also that kind of late 70s, that's the rebirth of the Australian cinema, filmmaking, and there was an interest in, I think, Australian identity again, I think at that time. And it all fits into that nostalgic sort of story.
Still, on the plus side, it means Andrew can go into the restoration process with confidence that he's not working on Australia's equivalent of the crown jewels, with all of the pressure that comes with a job like that.
In some ways, yeah. I won't be so nervous about it in that respect. But there's other things that the 70s was an era when they were still using slot-headed screws as opposed to Phillips. All of the screws that I've found on that are slotted screws. So if I replace parts, I'll use slotted screws. All the nuts on the bolts are square nuts. You can't buy square nuts anymore. You have to make them if you want them. So it's of its era as well. I think they make a much more accessible version, that's one thing. But like I say, this was built to plans that originated in the era. It's just they've made shortcuts in the construction. It's not going to fall apart. I think this has had use, as far as I can tell, use driving people around. It's just not going to last if you were racing it around, at a canter on rough roads like the proper ones were. But I think it's valuable too, because you can still see exactly the way it's set up, suspension-wise, steps, how people got in and out, the seating. It's still got the positions where the passengers originally sat. So, it still tells that story as well. And to most people, it doesn't really matter. If it looks the same from a distance, it's a Cobb Co coach. So then that goes back to the Toowoomba connection, because Jeff Ernst, as far as I could tell, had the plans that Cole drew up of how to build a Cobb Co coach. And when you look at this vehicle closely, all of it's there, as you would expect in a Cobb Co coach. All the parts, but they're not the same. Instead of being blacksmith made or forged, they are fabricated from flat steel and round bar with threads on them. And even the size of those members, particularly the ones that hold the ends, that tension the leather, the thorough brace. They're big beefy U-bolts and huge big threads and turnbuckles. These are way smaller. Yeah. It's apparently all that metalwork was done by a local fabricator. That's one of the other respondents said. It was definitely made by a guy that was used to welding with an arc welder. It just, then I started thinking, all right, who else could have something I could compare? And I found out that Carter's output was prolific, and he sold several of these, and he sold one to Charleville. It was for a celebration for a historic event, and it was quite expensive. I believe the price there was something like the equivalent of $90,000 now. And it's still there at they call it the Historic House Museum. So I contacted them and got someone to photograph identifiable parts that I could compare with this vehicle. And then another guy called Ian Stewart Costa, who was really well known in the horse-drawn fraternity, particularly with heavy horses, was one of the respondents to my question. I've met him several times before about Harvey Carter, and he said, I owned a vehicle that Harvey Carter built. I bought it, and it's got the suspension, but it's a brake. It's not a coach, but it's got the same undercarriage. So I got him to photograph it and send to me. So I've got 3 comparable sets of photos of the ends of each thoroughbrace, and looking at in the end, they're identical. The 3 sets of photographs really, I think, cemented that they came out of the same workshop. It's almost like a fingerprint. And I reckon that the vehicle was built by Harvey Carter. Whether it was Mullaney, most people seem to think he was just outside Gympie, but North Coast, and one of quite a few vehicles he built like that, and probably late 70s